We are on day 3 of Creation to Christ, where we're going to be particularly looking at today the rest of the Old Testament. So a lot of Israel's history, and then a big thing for today's video is going to be God's provision, how he provides for his people. And then leading into day 4 of this series, how God will provide a substitute to deal with humanity's problem of sin. So we're going to primarily focus today on Israel's journey through the wilderness, the law or the Ten Commandments, which I'm sure you've probably heard of. This strange account of a snake on a pole, we'll go into more detail about later on, as well as the tabernacle and a brief summary towards the end of Israel's history after they've reached the Promised Land. Just to recap what we went over in the last 2 sessions, so Nathan went over the account of creation, in day 1, the fall of humanity, so that's the introduction of sin into the world. And then he also went over the flood and the account of Noah and his family. James yesterday in day 2 went over the Tower of Babel, the account of Abraham, and in particular the covenant that God had made with Abraham. He also looked at Israel's time in Egypt and how they were slaves under the rule of Pharaoh, the introduction of Moses, the 10 plagues that God had brought, including the Passover of course, and then ultimately how God led his people out of the land of Egypt. So we're going to continue on now with the account from that point. So the Israelites have just come out of Egypt. They were slaves in that land before God had brought them out through many signs and wonders. And the Israelites would have been a crowd made up of around 2.5 million people. This is a lot of people all travelling together on a journey. And as you can imagine, this probably would have been a bit of a task for poor old Moses, the leader of the Israelites. But as I mentioned before, as I mentioned at the start of this video, one of the things we're really going to be looking at here and throughout this whole video is going to be God's provision, how he provides the needs for his people. You see, God doesn't simply just leave it all down to Moses. I mean, after all, it would have been pretty difficult to shout instructions over to a group of around 2.5 million people. But instead, God actually travels with them as they depart out of Egypt in the form of a cloud. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of a cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so they could travel by day or night. So essentially, all the Israelites had to do was look at this fiery cloud. And this was God's way of guiding his people to their destination. And what was their destination exactly? Well, if you remember back to the book of Genesis, when God had made a covenant with someone called Abram, who later on would have his name changed to Abraham, the Bible says this: "On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, 'To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river the Euphrates.'" This place is referred to as the land of the Canaanites, or Canaan, and a place that was flowing with milk and honey. But to get there they had to travel through a desert, or another way that it's put in the Bible is a wilderness. This was basically a place where nobody lived. And God purposely led them down this route for a couple of reasons really. Number one, so that they wouldn't run into any enemies, but it was also an ideal environment for God to train and prepare his people before they were to enter into this promised land. At the same time though, there wasn't much food along the way, so naturally the people got pretty hungry. So they started to complain, and many of the Israelites even wished that they had stayed in Egypt, because at least there, they would have had enough food to have kept them going, perhaps in their mindset. So rather than complaining, the Israelites could have simply just asked God for food. That would have been the easiest option, and God would have happily met their needs. He would have provided for them. But despite the people's complaints, God didn't just abandon them and leave them to it. He lovingly provided them with both bread and meat to eat and water to drink. And they didn't even have to work for any of it. The Lord simply gave it to them out of his grace. So God kindly provided for his people's needs and forgave them for all their constant complaining and bickering, finger pointing, etc. Something you could argue that they didn't really deserve. They didn't deserve that forgiveness from God for the way that they were speaking to him, the way they were viewing him. But God here is showing here that he is a God of patience, full of grace and mercy and love, and he cares for man despite the things that he does wrong. Eventually the Lord led the Israelites to a place called Mount Sinai, where he began to begin the next process of revealing himself to his people. The Lord had said to the Israelites that they were to be his people, or in other words, that they were to be an example to the rest of the world. They had seen with their eyes that God provides and cares for them, but they still clearly had a lot to learn. They didn't really know the character of God at this point, or what he was like. So God had to communicate this to them in some way. So up until now, God hadn't really asked for Israel to do anything, just to simply trust in him. But here at Mount Sinai, God is going to ask Israel to do something, and quite a few things actually. God gave the Israelites a whole set of laws, and this includes the infamous 10 Commandments, which I'm sure you're familiar with or have heard of. The 10 Commandments were like the basic terms of agreement between God and his people, and the other laws were kind of an additional collection of commands about worship, social justice, how they were to live together, etc. And if the Israelites were to obey these commands, they would be fulfilling their purpose, really, of representing God to the rest of the nations. God is calling them to be a kingdom of priests, again, connecting back to the promise of Abraham that his descendants would become a blessing to all the nations. These laws not only revealed God's character to the Israelites, but they also revealed what sin was as well. Sin kind of simply meaning what God views to be wrong or disobedient. Over the process of time, for example, Israel could have convinced themselves that, cheating or lying or stealing or worshipping another god was okay. That's fine, we can get away with that sort of thing, not a big deal. But the law, God's law, clearly stated that it was wrong. We have something that we don't want, a sinful nature that is within us, and we have this sinful nature because of Adam and Eve's disobedience back in the Garden of Eden, if you remember back. In the beginning, humanity was in God's presence. They had this good, close and personal relationship with God, but then of course they rebelled and the relationship became fractured, and access to God's presence from that point onward was lost. And why was this exactly? Why couldn't humans have access to God again like in the beginning? Well, because a perfect and holy God cannot be in the presence of someone or something that isn't perfect. If the Israelites were to break just one of these commandments, it would be as if they'd broken all of them in one go. And they'd be found guilty in God's eyes. Man's righteousness has to be equal, it must be equal to God's righteousness in order to have that restored relationship. Now, some of you may be thinking, that sounds a bit harsh, and perhaps, that's understandable. But again, as we go on with this account, we'll continue to see how God actually deals with this problem. And it's important to once again remember God's covenant with Abraham. God promised that he would restore his blessing to all the nations, and that includes this restoration of relationship and access to his presence once again.